Feeling like a black sheep, living in society where everybody's happy with their spoon-fed false reality.
Welcome, everyone, to the long version with Fletcher Long and Charles Rollo. We have another interesting program today. We're going to be talking about the coming release of the Mueller Report, which is going to probably be seriously redacted. And we're going to talk about the Constitution and can the Constitution be done away with? Fletcher, what's your take on what's going to happen with this Mueller report? I just got a feeling we're going to get this Reader's Digest version.
Well, I think we clearly are. I think that some people have estimated we're going to get as much as 60% of the Mueller report is going to be redacted. And to me, there are two subplots that I think are pretty interesting to watch. How much of the Mueller report is going to be released? How much of the Mueller report is the Congress empowered to require produced, at least to them? And whether the Conways are going to get a divorce. One of Trump's biggest members of his administration is what is the Conway lady's first name? Kellyanne.
Yes,
Kellyanne Conway. Yeah. And what's interesting is one of the president's biggest detractors is Kellyanne Conway's husband, George Conway. And there was a sentence in the letter that the Attorney General William Barr sent to Congress that is a synopsis, isn't a synopsis, is a summary, isn't a summary, whatever, where he says the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. George Conway has opined or tried to surmise that he's willing to bet that the word that was omitted, because the way that the quote was in the letter showed that they were getting a partial sentence and not the entire sentence. But he has posed the question. He said, I bet that sentence started with although. And so it's George Conway's belief, and he could not be a more strident presidential detractor. You're aware of this. He couldn't get any more inapposite to the administration in which his wife serves, which I just cannot fathom. Either that is causing untold amount of stress within the confines of their marital bed, or one or the other of them is being deceitful. Either Kellyanne Conway is not a Trump supporter, as she certainly pretends to be, or George Conway is not a critic, as he pretends to be. But anyway, if you throw the word although in there, that sentence reads, although the investigation did not establish the members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities, and then it implies that there's more to the sentence. So I imagine most people, when it gets released, the Mueller report, are going to turn right to that sentence to see what was the word that came before thee.
Yeah, and let's in this world that we live in, say what not is said is almost as important as what is said.
Well, I think it's always been. What you omit versus what you say. There are two ways that you can prevaricate. And if you don't believe it, just ask your wife. One of them is what you say being foundationally untrue, and the other is when you omit information intentionally that you know that the query is reasonably requesting. Right? That's kind of like a lie by omission. But now I want to make this clear, because in a fraud case, now, if someone accuses you of committing a fraud or being fraudulent, you can't lie by omission anymore. The first element of a fraud is that you make a misstatement of fact that's materially untrue and that you knew it was untrue at the time that it was being made. right?
Right.
So you can't commit a fraud by omission, but there are a lot of wives out there that'll tell you that you can certainly lie by omission. That
Oh,
you can lie, you can lie without saying anything, right?
right. You can just dance around the issues, and I've seen that many times, and it's I hate the lies by omission, because for someone who's not well studied in the art of debate and investigation, it's easy to get around the truth by just omitting it.
Well, one of the key things to do when you're an attorney and you examine witnesses, Charles, and I did this for 20 years, one of the key things to do is you have to craft your questions in such a manner to where they don't permit someone to just dodge the issue. And if you're asking questions that permit someone to just dodge the issue, then you're not very good at asking questions.
Right.
You have to elicit from someone information, and some people get so caught up in trying to sound intelligent. It's always a double-edged sword, trying to sound like you're learned or intelligent to the exclusion of getting the information that actually needs to be in any record, whatever this record is, whether it's just a record between you and me as individuals discussing something, or a record between you and your wife, a court record, no matter what record. But you really want to, and you have to do this as a parent, Charles. I mean, you have to ask your kids questions that cannot be dodged, right? Yes. And so you have to make them pretty plainly worded, so that there can't be a lot of play in the response. And that's difficult to do in English, because English is almost inherently ambiguous. There's a lot of, there's a lot of difference. For instance, if you were to say to me, "You look nice today," inflection is everything. You could really think that I look nice, or you could be saying, "Well, you look nice today." Like, yeah. I don't look nice at all. To the contrary. So English lends itself to duplicity, doesn't it? The language does. Inflection, tone, there's all kinds of things that weigh into what one means when one says something.
And the inflection part, unless it's actually recorded for playback, is easy to get missed in any kind of investigation. I mean, they said, "You look beautiful," or "You look good," but the inflection's missing there. And then now it's up to the investigator to dig deep down in and find out what that meant.
Try to figure out what that meant. And I want to bring up for a moment what has got to be an apocalyptical moment, if that's even a word. I might have made that up.
That's
a sign of the apocalypse is the burning down of Notre Dame Cathedral. That I cannot tell you how there are so many things that are going on right now in the world that make me think, and I'm not one of these religious doomsday prophets, but we got to be coming to the end of days, Charles. When things like Notre Dame catches fire and burns virtually to the ground, I mean, that's not a good sign. I just don't think that that's a good sign. But here's my question to you, speaking of the Mueller report, and I get off Notre Dame for a moment. But what do you think this report is going to say about his obstructing justice? Because that's what I am most particularly interested in hearing. Because, Mueller deferred a prosecutorial decision to William Barr, which intimates to me that the report itself raises a prosecutorial question. I mean, he clearly states in the report, from what we have seen thus far, from what was quoted from the report in the 4-page letter, he clearly states that this report neither indicts nor does it exonerate the president for obstructing justice. So, and that there was evidence on both sides of that question or issue. That's what got Nixon in trouble, obstructing justice. I'm just wondering, what do you think that's going to mean?
I think that obviously when the report is released that the Trump detractors are not going to be happy with what they get. And I think that there's going to be little bits and pieces in there that can be interpreted in more than one way. And so you're going to look at these interpretations, and one side is going to interpret it one way and the other is going to interpret it another way. I think that the whole investigation sort of is, you look at it, it's a moot point. What we're doing now is we're fighting over the crumbs on the table because Trump's already the president, and there's not going to be anything in that report that's going to make him leave office. And I don't think he would, even if there was, because he's got a death grip on that seat. And I think that we're going to find there's going to be more conflagration. There's going to be more strife and conflict that's brought out by the little bits and pieces that they're going to cling to.
Well, I want to take you back to Watergate, and I want to take you back to a time, that was what the commission's findings were vis-a-vis Richard Nixon, that he had obstructed justice in the Watergate scandal. That was going to be one of the articles of impeachment that were going to be brought against the president. Barry Goldwater, and back in that day, like today, the Democrats had the House of Representatives, and the Republicans had a pretty substantial majority in the Senate. And I remember that there was a rather poignant moment when Barry Goldwater went with some conservative senators to the White House to meet with Nixon. And Nixon said, Barry, if this thing goes to vote, impeachment, they try it in the House, but the Senate is the jury. He said, Barry, if this thing goes to vote, how many of you boys have got my back, or words to that effect? And Barry said, Goldwater said, Mr. President, you will be convicted, and I'm one of the ones who will vote to convict you.
Barry Goldwater, my camera's froze here, but I'll just keep talking, is not the complete right winger that a lot of people make him out to be.
Well, he liberaled up late in his life.
Yeah.
But I mean, let me tell you this about Barry. Now, my dad is a big conservative, huge conservative, big Trump fan, a big Trump guy. And I'll tell you this about Barry Goldwater. My dad once told me that the saddest day of his life was the day that Barry Goldwater lost the presidency to Lyndon Johnson. But I understand what you're saying. Goldwater, he was the father of the conservative movement at one time. He did liberal up quite a bit prior to dying.
Yeah, and I can't recall all the things that I read about him, but he did some things that would be considered liberal actions when he was in office on there. But go ahead.
Let me ask you this question, Charles. Is there any such thing as liberal and conservative anymore? I mean, is there any such thing as Democrat and Republican? It just seems to me that there are Trump's supporters and Trump's detractors.
Yeah, and let's face it, I am one of those disenfranchised conservatives that I'm like, wow, here I am in the middle trying to, I'm a conservative, but I'm not altogether, those way out there in the right wing. I mean, I feel we should help people. There should be some kind of plan to help our fellow citizens and do some cross aisle conversation. And we just have these people that are far left and far right. And I'm disenfranchised. I'm in the right middle, disenfranchised by the whole thing. And I don't know. There's not that. Well, let me say this. There was one comment I heard, and I can't remember where I heard it at. But the fact that the extreme socialist groups consider it to be a failure if you engage in debate. That is crazy, in my mind.
There's another issue about the Mueller report coming out that is pretty interesting that's being developed now, Charles, that I think is really fascinating. If you will remember, there was more than one either present or former White House official that was called upon to cooperate with the special counsel's investigation. And with this report coming out Thursday, the question has been asked by Carol Lee and Hallie Jackson and Kristen Walker with NBC News, how many of these people are going to be outed on Thursday as being the source to the special counsel of damaging information, and what will the wrath of Donald Trump, how terrible will it be, and how directed and pointed at them will it be? How many of them are going to lose their jobs?
Oh, I'm sure there's going to be a plethora of people that are just going to, when the hand grenade is thrown and it explodes, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to suffer for that. They're going to be bailed. They're going to be thrown out, kicked out, and run away.
Well, you're right, but I want you to think about this for a second. These people are career government employees. They've been taught their entire professional lives that the government were the good guys. They were to cooperate with their government. They were to ask the questions put to them by the government. And then all of a sudden, they work in an administration with a president who's gotten sideways with the Justice Department. Those are two branches of government. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you work for Trump. You work in the White House. You're a White House official, and the special counsel appointed by the Attorney General of the United States wants to ask you questions. I mean, all your life, every training, every professional amount of training you've ever received and any professional experience you may have ever accumulated tells you got to go in and answer those questions and answer them as truthfully as you can.
Yes.
And so, I mean, and you're talking about a guy that may be your boss, being the president of the United States, but you're also talking, you work for the United States government, and that Robert Mueller sitting in front of you, that is the United States government. That is a Justice Department special counsel.
I think it really would go back to what you were saying before about lies of omission. And do you omit, or do you just lay it out there and tell the truth and suffer the consequences?
I think that many of these people felt the compunction to lay it out there because that's what they were trained to do. That's what they've done all their lives. Government work doesn't lend itself to independent thought. Right. At anything other than the highest levels. There's a whole lot of people in the government that do what they do because they were told to do it. You agree with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it doesn't lend its, somebody once said about the United States Army that we don't want people questioning why they're charging the machine gun. We just want them to charge the damn machine gun, right? Yeah. And so there's a lot of people in government service that get marching orders. They're just supposed to follow the marching orders. From what we're hearing from released reports, there's close to a breakdown level of anxiety among some of the current and former staffers who were called upon to cooperate, and have cooperated with the investigation. And they're very concerned about what the Trump legal team is going to do when this information is known. And it's known what parcels of information are attributable to what sources. It seems to me that's going to be, there's so much about this situation that's going to bear watching as we go forward. If you like news and drama, it's a very fun time to be alive.
Yeah.
Outside of the fact that Notre Dame Cathedral nearly burned to the ground yesterday, and it's the end times. But other than that, it's a very interesting time to be alive. What do you think about that? Well, how many people are pretty tight in the sphincter area today? Would you imagine? Yeah,
they're probably drinking heavily if they drink, and maybe even if they don't drink, they're drinking heavily. But if I were in their position, I would be extremely have a lot of anxiety. I'd be upset about that. Let's talk about that more next show. Once the report's out and we get a chance to see it, we're going to talk about the Constitution, and there are people out there now that fear the Constitution will be suspended or done away with. And I had done a little looking around about that. And it's interesting, national emergency, the times of war, the Constitution can be suspended.
You ever heard of the Declaration of Martial Law? Because that's kind of exactly what you're talking about. And martial law suspends the Constitution.
Yes. Yes. And so, but there has to be a process for that to suspend it. Now, one thought that occurred to me is that what if they wanted to replace the Constitution? It's not actually suspending it, but it's a process of replacing it.
Well, we actually have some historical context for that, because that's what they did when they replaced the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. And like we talked about last week, I think Article 2, Section 7 of the Constitution certainly indicates that the Constitution, if it is no longer felt by the governed to govern them by their consent, or to create a government that governs them by their consent, that they can in fact overthrow or reform a government that does govern by their consent. So, I mean, it's a real poignant question now, more so than it has ever been. There have been declarations of martial law in American history. Lord Dunmore, by proclamation, declared martial law in May 27th of 1775. Months after the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Lincoln made a declaration of martial law, or proclamation of martial law, suspended the Constitution during the Civil War. I could see that being something. Well, yes, I mean the martial laws being imposed during conflicts, in cases of occupation, or when there's an absence of civil government that provides for the stability of the population, is a temporary thing. We actually made a declaration of martial law post World War II in Germany, as we militarily ruled the reconstruction of Germany and Japan. So it's been there's some historical precedent for it.
Okay. In a case there, I had not been able to nail down the exact procedure for doing that, but someone had wrote that it has to be an overwhelming majority for the Constitution to be suspended. Do you know about that? Do you have any?
I would guess it's a super majority, but I'm guessing here. You have to do it by you have to have a proclamation or to suspend the Constitution and declare a state of martial law. Then it has to be voted on, probably by the Senate. I would think it would probably take a minimum of a 2/3 vote, maybe even higher. But what happens when martial law is you get curfews, the suspension of civil law, the suspension of civil rights, the suspension of habeas corpus relief, which means people can be jailed without due process of law and held for a period of time. What happens is they start applying military law and military justice to civilians, which is you start having courts martial, where the subject of the courts martial or the subject of the court martial is a civilian as opposed to a military person. And I defended several courts martial, at least a couple in my career. And military law, there's a lot about military law that kind of recommends it. In it's superior in some respects, I believe, to the civil law. I'll tell you one way it's superior. In the civil law and criminal jurisprudence, the police do not view their job as much as getting to the truth, but it's getting to our truth. We want to get to the version of events that we are convinced is the correct one. And we're going to disregard any evidence that would tend to refute that, and we're going to bolster and produce any evidence that we believe supports it. Military law is not that way. I mean, those criminal investigation officers go out there and investigate the underpinnings of a court martial, and they literally record the evidence even the evidence, and they give it to the defense counsel, even the evidence that kills their case. I won a court martial one time, Charles, based off the evidence that the Criminal Investigation Division had given me. I mean, a civil police force, and I hate to say this because this doesn't sound good, but a civil police force would have likely tossed in the trash can some of the statements that CID gave me.
Yes, and actually there is a case that's been under review here in Michigan. I think it's Jerome Kowalski, and he is because of collusion and a relationship between the investigating the detective and the judge, and information that was not brought into trial or evidence. He is going to be retried. He is.
There have been lots of incidences where convictions have been overturned because prosecutors have buried what's called Brady material, which is material that tends to suggest that the accused didn't commit an offense. There was a really famous case in Texas where they actually sanctioned the prosecutor for doing it. Most of the time, nothing happens to the prosecutor for doing it. But in case in Texas, they had a murder overturned where there was like something that completely exonerated the subject of the prosecution that this prosecutor had just buried in the file and refused, even when asked for it, refused to turn it over to defense counsel. Is really, I actually had a show on that case when I was on analog radio, when I was riding the stick in the ground that is radio, traditional radio, not today's digital radio.
Right. So the techniques and the procedures that are used by the civil police force sometimes are. For instance, it is legal for a investigator in a civil case or a civil investigation to actually lie to the person they're interrogating.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
It's crazy.
There's a Supreme Court decision on point that says that sometimes you have to use the artifices and techniques of the underworld in order to catch members of it, which I think is total horseshit. Here's the thing. If you're the government, you're the government. If you wear a white hat, you need to wear the white hat. I don't think you catch criminals by becoming a criminal. I think there has to be a line of demarcation between the good guys and the bad guys. And I think that when you start crossing the line, even if your objectives are noble, even, the dirty, I think one of the worst things that ever happened to us in popular culture was the Dirty Harry cop from the Dirty Harry movies, the Clint Eastwood movies, the Charles Bronson guy, the vigilantes, the guys that clearly violated the law, but it was okay because they were bringing misery and death and destruction on terrible people. And so the end justified the means. Well, in criminal jurisprudence, Charles, the end does not justify the means. That's what due process of law means, is that the means of how we obtain a conviction are important in a free society. You can't just put the thumb screws on them until they tell you something you've already determined to be the truth. And that's the problem with criminal prosecution, is that too many times the investigator in a civil matter goes, not a civil matter, a criminal matter, but civil law, not martial law, but civil law.
Correct.
The investigator enters into the investigation having already worked the problem. Okay, he has the solution to the problem already. All he's looking for are items of information, statements, or evidence that would corroborate the answer at which he has already arrived. And so he tends to disregard anything that challenges his result, right? If I'm working a math problem and I start out with the answer's 4, and I'm stuck on the answer's 4, and the problem turns out to be 2 + 6, I've got to do some gerrymandering to find ways to work that problem that will come up with the solution that I predetermined to be the answer, right? Of course, that's an oversimplistic example because we both know that 2 + 6 is 8. But, that is exactly what happens in police work today. That's what got them in O.J. Simpson. That's what, they believed O.J. Simpson had committed the crime before they ever arrived at the scene. And all they were going to do was make sure that the crime scene either did reflect their preconceived solution or could be moved around and gerrymandered to support it. And they got caught gerrymandering the crime scene, by a group of skilled lawyers who and there were cameras everywhere. And I mean, they got caught.
The prosecution was outclassed in that trial by a long shot. I mean, they were up against the best of the best. And the one thing that I remember that stands out in my mind about that trial is the glove thing. Trying on the gloves, and he's like, "It don't fit." And I'm like, that's
just a great story. And F. Lee Bailey, who lives above a beauty parlor in South Carolina today, doesn't have an active license anywhere. He's been disbarred in 2 states, denied admission in a 3rd, but was one time the country's greatest trial lawyer. It's really sad what happens to trial lawyers. We end up doing shows like the long version, and stuff like that.
With me.
Yeah, well, that's not all that sad. That's actually pretty good. But F. Lee Bailey went up and it might not have been Bailey. It might have been the other guy that settled all his cases. He really wasn't much of a trial lawyer. But he went up during one of the breaks and he got the bailiff to let him try the gloves on, and they didn't fit him. And he knew that his hands were way smaller than OJ's, right? And so Bailey, knowing that, he goes up there to Darden and he basically says, if you don't have him try on these gloves, you're a wimp. Basically, he might even have used the P word, right?
Yeah.
But he tells Darden that if you don't have him try on these gloves, you're a wimp, right? Well, F. Lee Bailey's the greatest trial lawyer in American history, one of the greatest. If you're a lawyer, even if you're a prosecutor, you don't want to be called, you don't want to have F. Lee Bailey think you're a wimp, right? Trial practice is a very macho thing, And
my response to that would have been, something's up here. Why is he saying this?
Well, you would have thought that he would have thought that, but it worked on him. It got him to do it. Bailey kind of intimated, you won't have him try these gloves on because you're a coward.
Yeah.
And Darden, by God, stood up with Marcia Clark begging him not to, gets up and does it,
Yeah.
And the gloves didn't fit. And that's when Johnny Cochran came up with, he kind of changed directions. Their pretrial strategy was, if you cannot trust the messenger, you can't trust his message. They knew that they were going to call Mark Furman. He was on the pretrial witness list. Darden begged them not to call him. And they knew that Furman was a racist, and they knew where to go get the proof that he was a racist. They knew that he had given this interview and this taped statements to somebody that was in North Carolina, and they knew that he was a racist, and they knew that they could that he would never admit being a racist, right? He's never going to admit that. And then they could catch him in a lie, they could discredit him, and then they could look at the jury and say, hey, this is the guy that says it's O.J. Simpson. Well, if you can't trust him, you can't trust what he says, right? If you can't trust the messenger, you can't trust his message.
Yeah, that was the source, yeah.
That's what they came into trial with. That was the trial. I knew Johnny Cochran. He and I had a case in the federal courthouse in Nashville back years ago when I was a young lawyer and he was still alive, right? And I sat and talked to him one day for a couple hours. And he told me that that's what they went into trial with, right? And this was when Johnny Cochran was representing the black doctors who went into the emergency room with their kid, and Vanderbilt called DCS and said the kid had been abused because he had bruises. And the whole subject of the lawsuit was, you wouldn't have called the cops if we'd have been white doctors. You called the cops and surmised that this kid had been abused because we're black. That's why you called the cops. If we'd have been white doctors, you wouldn't have called the police. You would have given a white doctor the benefit of the doubt, which I don't know that the ER knew that they were doctors at all. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
They just knew they were black people, and the kid had bruises. And well, anyway, so they hired Johnny Cochran. He sued Vanderbilt. I had a case on the docket the same day that case was set for some sort of motion argument or something, right? And so I was on that docket that day too I can't even remember my case. I remember Johnny's case. I can't remember mine, right?
Right.
Well, he told me that they went into trial with that strategy, that this was our strategy. He said, but the second those gloves didn't fit, he knew that they were going to argue, if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. Well, Johnny Cochran told me years ago that that's how you win a lawsuit. You have to come up with something. And I always tried to do this. I tried over 200 criminal jury trials myself, Charles, and I always tried to come up with a theme for the trial, right? And if I couldn't come up with a theme, I'd come up with a theme. There's always a theme, right? I had a case one time where I had a state trooper that had met an internet hooker at a hotel and given her drugs out of his drug case. He was a canine officer and had sex with her, and was busted by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, right? But in the video of the bust, she looks at the pills, closes the pill up, puts them on the bed, and walks out, and the TBI comes in and arrests him. Well, what I wanted to show the jury was, look, there was no delivery. She never accepted the pills. There was no delivery.
Right.
She should have taken a pill or two out, put it in her pocket. And so my theme to that case was, my client is guilty as hell, but he's guilty of adultery.
Yeah.
And you don't have the right to judge him for that, but he will be judged. He just won't be judged by you. And so my theme was, judge not, lest ye be judged. Trial court probably should not have allowed me to argue that at all, because it's biblical, and I'm calling on their sense of Christianity to forbear judgment. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's theming a case, and you always want to theme a case. Well, that was their theme, was initially, if you can't trust the messenger, you can't trust his message, and then it became, if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. But that's part of the brilliance that it takes to be a trial lawyer. Is you have to be able to switch directions on a dime, right? On a moment's notice, you got to be able to switch directions. Right. If you can't do that, you can't be a trial lawyer. You can go push paper around a desk, but you can't be a trial lawyer if you're not fast on your feet. You got to be able to present well.
Okay, so we got a few more minutes left on the clock here, and I wanted to revisit. We had a discussion last show about legal tender and whether it's acceptable or must be taken for payment. And I went to the Treasury, U.S. Treasury website, and what I came up with this is that this is the answer they give. The pertinent portion of the law that applies to the question is Coinage Act of 1965, specifically Section 31, USC 5103, entitled Legal Tender, and states United States coins and currency, including Federal Reserve notes and circulating notes of Federal Reserve banks and national banks, are legal tender for all debts, public charges, taxes, and dues. This statute means that all United States money is identified above our valid and legal offer for payment for debts when tendered to a creditor. There is, however, no federal statute mandating that a private business, a person, or an organization must accept currency or coins as for payment for goods and or services.
Well, let me ask you this question then, Charles. If they don't have to accept payment for coins, then what is the alternate tender? What is the alternate? What's the alternative?
Yeah, well, today, I mean,
because and now I'm going to show you. This is how you practice law. This is the wordsmithery here.
I know. Right? I'm in for it.
This is not a situation where they won't take 100. It's not a situation where they're giving you an alternative manner or method of payment. They just won't. They'll accept legal tender. They won't accept that legal tender.
Well, I'm in agreement with you on the subject, but I'm just saying there is some basis for people saying we won't accept that.
Yeah, if they give you an alternative mode or method of payment. That's
Right.
what that says. They don't have to accept that legal. They don't have to accept legal tender at all, right? But if they're going to charge something for the goods or services, they got to give you a method to pay them, or you're just going to take it.
Well, the what they would say is on this day, the alternative method of payment would be, or then even would be a check, which is not cash. So this is specific.
Well, I guess they could require a check. Yeah, I guess they could require a check, and that would be legal. But what's not legal is saying we'll take a 20, but we won't take 100.
Right.
We'll take a 5, but we won't take a 20. That's not that. I did not, listening to that, what you read, I did not hear that saying at all that you can choose what level of legal tender you will accept to the exclusion of the rest of it, right? In other words, if you're requiring it be paid with legal tender and I want to pay it in pennies, you can't say I won't accept pennies, but I will take dollars. I didn't read that code saying that at all. I think you can say I won't take pennies, but you can write me a check.
Yeah, it was more of like an either or, but there's another part to this too. Let me just read the rest of that. Private businesses are free to develop their own policies on whether or not they accept cash unless there's a state law which otherwise, for example, a bus line may prohibit payment of fares in pennies or dollars. In addition, movie theaters, convenience stores, and gas stations may refuse to accept large denomination currency, usually notes above $20.
When did that pass?
1965.
Wow. No. That's when that's when the Coinage Act passed.
Right.
When did the provision allowing them to not accept currency above a certain level pass? Because that didn't pass in 1965. That was not the law when I went to law school.
Okay, so let me just go back, look at it real quick here.
I think they have passed that because of people.
This is one of those omission things where it says there's no statute that forces that to happen.
Right.
So it's an open area of undefined law.
Well, I read in that last part now you read, I do read as saying that they can refuse a bill over a 20. I read that. I hear that as saying that. But I'm going to tell you that that's an amendment to the 1965 Coinage Act.
Yeah,
what I'm telling you.
We could probably dig deeper into that.
I'll give you an example, Charles. In 1965, they passed the Civil Rights Act, right? Mm-hmm. It said that you couldn't discriminate against somebody based on their national origin, color, creed, religion. Well, in 1994, they amended it, and they added stuff like disabilities and sexual orientation and stuff like that. You see what I'm saying? So the original act, as it passed in 65, the Civil Rights Act that Kennedy worked on and got passed, was basically you can't discriminate because of these 4 areas: race, creed, national origin, religion. That's it. That was it. It's more expansive than that today. Okay.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of things. It's expand, but that doesn't mean that the new stuff to which it has been expanded didn't pass in 65. It passed later, right? I'm just telling you, under the Coinage Act of 1960, when I was in law school, we were taught that if you provided legal tender for a debt, public or private, they had to accept it or provide you with an alternative mode of payment. There was none of this. They don't have to take a bill over 20, right?
Right.
But apparently they've had a big enough lobby. You know, McDonald's has a big lobby. Wendy's has a big lobby. Apparently they have gotten them to amend that act to include that a business can tell you that they're not going to take something larger than a 20 because they don't want to give you all of their change. You know,
right.
But the thing I still don't understand about that is I've had them refuse $100 bill from me when I had spent nearly 2/3 of it in the store. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, I've spent $70. Why won't why can't I pay with 100 if I've already spent $70? Why can't you give me back a 10 and a 20? Why'd I have to give you 4 20s, instead of giving you $100 bill? And when I've spent almost all of it in here.
Yeah, and well, I'll tell you, I can't remember the last time I've had a $20 bill. Everything I do is on cards and debit cards and other things. But here's another avenue that's slowly creeping in and is getting ready for mass adoption is cryptocurrency.
Right.
And
you're a big proponent of cryptocurrency. You've been trying to get me on it.
Yeah, I'm trying to get you on that drug because it's inevitable that it's going to happen. Let's look at just one. I'll just cover this real shortly because we've got only a few more minutes left. But I have a cryptocurrency wallet and I can actually send money directly to another person, bypassing the centralized financial institutions. I don't have to go through them anymore. I can send my money direct. I have full control over it. And this is what people are looking for, is a decentralized platform in order to do that. And I think eventually what we're going to see is this, the government is already starting to investigate this as far as their own uses. And there are many companies out there now establishing these currencies. Now, the one problem that they're working on solving is interoperability, because if you have one coin, you may not be able to send it to someone if they don't have the proper blockchain technology to receive it, or the proper blockchain. So they're working on the interoperability problems on there. But I have the option of sending anyone up to 30 different kinds of cryptocurrency. I mean, pick one. You don't like that one? I'll send you this one. So there's some flexibility there. But I think that eventually this is really going to force the financial industry to change, and I see that coming.
Well, I'll tell you, times they are a changing, as David Bowie once said. Changes.
Yeah, they are. That's the only thing we can count on, really, is change.
I tell you, there's so many things. The barcodes. People go around now and use the barcode to pay with their phone at different places and stuff. And I remember somebody telling me one time back years ago that they felt like the barcode was the mark of the beast that's talked about in the end days and Revelations, that's the mark of the beast. And they said that back at a time when we weren't using barcodes for everything. And every time I see someone using their barcode, I'm thinking, oh my God, it's the end days, And I also remember I had a science teacher in 7th grade that told me back in the early 1980 or so that if the average temperature on the planet ever got to 55 degrees, that the polar ice caps would all melt, that the continental United States would flood clear up to Kentucky, and everything else would be underwater. And he said, oh, by the way, the present global average temperature is 54.1. Well, what do we see complained of in climate change today? Is that our average temperature is rising. What's melting, Charles? The polar ice caps are melting. What's going on? We're having more natural disaster type of weather, be it tsunami or be it flooding or tidal waves or whatever, heavy rain, severe droughts. We had places in California that people say are flooding or going to be underwater in a few years. And people saying that the earth will end by 2030 unless we make real changes in our carbon emissions. So I thought that was pretty outlandish when I heard it in 7th grade, but I see incidences of it today that concern me.
Yes. Well, I'm in favor of not polluting our environment. strongly in favor. I recycle. I'm probably in my neighborhood, I do more recycling than probably 4 or 5 of my neighbors put together. But there is one option here that we need to consider, and that is that climate change could be a natural occurrence. I mean, the warming and cooling of the planet could be something that happens naturally. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be adhering to, safer, better, cleaner energy and ways to not pollute our environment, because I see a lot of pollution in our environment. It's affecting us. It's affecting nature. It's affecting everybody. But there's a possibility that this climate change is a natural occurring factor.
Well, I'll tell you this. I believe that overall, the weather that I'm subjected to over the course of a year is much more intemperate than when I was growing up.
Yes.
Now that may just be the memory. That may be the memory of an older man longing for the glory days. I don't know.
Well, I
it
do.
May be the fantasy that the older days were better than the present days. But I'm of a pretty strong belief that I'm facing much more intemperate weather on a yearly basis in Kentucky than I did when I was growing up here.
Oh, and I would agree with that too as well. So let's wrap up here, and we're going to take a look at the Mueller report once it's released for the next show, and maybe we'll come up with a few more topics. We just want to thank everyone for viewing, and whatever platform you see this on, there's an opportunity to upvote or to amplify or whatever it is to share. Please do that for us, and we'll be glad, and we'll see you the next time on the long version.
Feeling like a black sheep, living in society where everybody's happy with their spoon-fed false reality.